Imagine a world where everything you know is turned upside down. Countries you thought were allies become enemies, and the entire globe plunges into a conflict so massive, it's called the Great War. But this wasn't just another war, it was a war that redefined nations, empires, and the entire course of human history. Welcome to the untold story of World War I, the conflict that didn't just change nations, but changed humanity forever. World War I, fought from 1914 to 1918, stands as one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It was a war of empires, driven by ambition, politics, and one singular event that ignited a global inferno and assassination that no one saw coming, but everyone would feel. How did World War I start? Europe in the early 20th century was like a tightly coiled spring, ready to explode. Tensions were high, with nations jostling for power, and alliances knitting the continent into a fragile web. You had the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain facing off against the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. But alliances alone didn't explain the looming disaster. Three forces were also building pressure: nationalism, militarism, and imperialism. Nations were fiercely proud of their identities, expanding their empires, and preparing for war as a means of asserting dominance. Every country seemed to be waiting for an excuse to flex its military muscle. And then it happened June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a trigger. In a matter of days, Europe's carefully maintained balance unraveled. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia backed Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. The alliance system clicked into gear, and within weeks, Europe and soon the world was at war. But was the war inevitable? Could cooler heads have prevailed? These are questions historians still debate today. The trenches, the war on the Western Front. This wasn't a war of swift victories or noble cavalry charges. On the Western Front, the war became a brutal, grinding stalemate. The soldiers dug in, literally constructing vast networks of trenches that would define much of the conflict. Imagine this: you're in the trenches, trapped for months on end, surrounded by mud, rats, and the constant threat of death. The skies above you are filled with artillery shells, and the land between you and the enemy, called no man's land, is a barren wasteland of barbed wire and corpses. This is where some of the bloodiest battles in history took place. Let's dive into two infamous examples: the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. At Verdun, the French and Germans clashed for nearly a year. Over 700,000 men were killed or wounded, and yet, by the end of the battle, the front lines had barely moved. It was a symbol of the war's futility, thousands dying for inches of ground. The Somme is remembered for one day in particular: July 1, 1916, the worst day in British military history. By nightfall, over 57,000 British soldiers lay dead or wounded. The battle itself stretched for months and claimed over 1 million casualties in total. Life in the trenches wasn't just hard, it was soul-crushing. Shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, became a common affliction. Letters from soldiers describe an existence of constant fear, hunger, and the overwhelming sense that death was always just around the corner. New weapons, new terrors. World War I was the dawn of industrialized warfare, where technology outpaced humanity's understanding of its consequences. For the first time in history, the tools of war were evolving at a terrifying speed. The battlefield introduced deadly new technologies. Capable of mowing down hundreds of men in minutes, machine guns turned open fields into death traps. First used by the British in 1916, tanks were slow and clunky at first, but they revolutionized ground warfare, allowing soldiers to advance through the deadly landscapes of no man's land. Perhaps the most feared weapon, mustard gas and chlorine gas, brought terror to the trenches. A single gust of wind could send these invisible killers floating toward enemy lines, suffocating or blinding soldiers in their boots. There was no real defense, only survival. For the first time, war wasn't just fought on the ground. Airplanes, initially used for reconnaissance, quickly became weapons of destruction, engaging in dogfights and bombing runs. The sky was no longer a place of peace. Naval warfare also took a deadly turn with the advent of the U-boat German submarines that hunted Allied ships across the seas. The sinking of civilian vessels like the Lusitania by U-boats brought the United States closer to the conflict. Global involvement beyond Europe. While much of the fighting took place in Europe, this was truly a world war. Across Africa, the Middle East, and even the Pacific, battles raged as colonial powers dragged their empires into the conflict. For example, Australia and New Zealand faced devastating losses in the failed campaign at Gallipoli, where they stormed the beaches in a bloody, ill-fated attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The aftermath of Gallipoli would haunt these nations and shape their national identities for generations. India sent over 1 million troops to fight in Europe, with many serving in brutal conditions on the Western Front. African soldiers from French and British colonies also played a crucial role, often fighting for empires they had no stake in. These contributions are often forgotten, but they were pivotal. America joins the fight. For the first 3 years, the United States watched from the sidelines, but that all changed in 1917, when 2 key events forced America's hand: Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which sank American ships, and the interception of the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany tried to coax Mexico into attacking the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of the war, now had no choice. With public support, the U.S. declared war in April 1917. America's entry into the conflict was a turning point. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, brought fresh manpower and resources to the exhausted Allies. By 1918, American troops were pouring into the trenches, tipping the scales in favor of the Allies. The armistice and its aftermath. By 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. With the United States now fully engaged, the Allies gained the upper hand. Germany, war-weary and facing internal revolts, was forced to negotiate. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent. The war was over, but the peace was anything but stable. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany was forced to pay crippling reparations, give up vast territories, and disarm. These harsh penalties humiliated Germany and would fuel the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, leading directly to World War II. But Germany wasn't the only loser. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire crumbled, leaving a chaotic legacy in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, one that still impacts global politics today. The legacy of World War I. World War I didn't just change borders, it changed humanity itself. The world had never seen such devastation. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. The lost generation, as they came to be called, was left to grapple with the senselessness of it all. The war also changed how people viewed conflict. Before, war had been seen as a noble pursuit, but after 4 years of slaughter in the trenches, that myth was shattered. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured this disillusionment in their poetry, forever altering how we think about war. Politically, World War I set the stage for much of the 20th century, from the rise of communism in Russia to the birth of the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. While the League would fail to prevent another world war, it marked the beginning of a new era of diplomacy. World War I changed the world forever. It wasn't just a conflict of soldiers and generals, it was a clash of ideologies, empires, and human endurance. It showed us the horrors of unchecked nationalism and the devastating consequences of modern warfare. So next time you hear about World War I, don't just think of it as another historical event. Think of it as a turning point in human history, a war that changed the world in ways we're still living with today. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world.